1916. War rages in Europe. In the United States, big business dominates the commercial landscape. Oil magnate John Rockefeller has just made his first billion. Andrew Carnegie has retired comfortably from steel and railroads. Henry Ford's Model Ts are selling like hotcakes. And Milton Hershey, the chocolate maker, is visiting Cuba for the first time, with a taste for something sweet. For just over a decade, Hershey has been making milk chocolate confections at his Pennsylvania factory. His greatest product so far, the 5-cent Hershey milk chocolate bar, is already an American favorite. Hershey's company is vertically integrated, meaning he controls, to the extent possible, means of production and key support industries, which include hundreds of acres of dairy farms, an extensive railway system, and a town complete with shops, schools, and social clubs. But there is one thing Hershey does not yet control: sugar. And the war in Europe is threatening his supply of this essential ingredient. Milton Hershey knows that the world's best sugar comes from sugarcane grown on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles off American shores. He buys up a swath of farmland in the lush Yumuri Valley, 30 miles east of the capital city, Havana. There he envisions a state-of-the-art refinery that will supply all the sugar he needs to make his chocolate. But Hershey will do more in Cuba than just turn profits. He will build a socially progressive empire unlike anything Cuba has ever known, shielded from the worst economic depression in modern history, and stay true to his most deeply held convictions.
In his office, he had a plaque, and it said, "Business is a matter of human service." You don't see that today in business, but that's what he truly believed.
Because of how Milton Hershey does things, creating what he needs rather than simply just, purchasing, I think that the challenge of Cuba made it an attractive venture for him.
Los salarios eran mejores, las consideraciones eran mejores, los pagos del alquiler de las viviendas eran más bajos, no había que pagar las reparaciones de las casas.
Nosotros nos sentimos privilegiados de haber nacido aquí en esa época.
This is the Hershey Cuban Railway. It's the only electric train in Cuba, and for more than 90 years it's been shuttling passengers back and forth between the cities of Havana and Matanzas. The railway was built by the Hershey Corporation between 1916 and 1921. It was such a technical marvel for its time that it earned an in-depth article in Scientific American magazine. The railway lines, all 251 miles of them, were designed primarily for transporting raw cane to mill and refined sugar to port. In 1921, passenger rail service was inaugurated eastward to Matanzas, and the following year westward to Havana. Passenger trains on the Hershey Cuban Railway ran every hour on the hour. The cars were comfortable and modern for the time. Each seated 50 passengers, and the trains traveled at the swift speed of 40 miles per hour. It was the only train in Cuba that ran on time.
Aquí no había nada, no había caña, no había nada, no había medio de transporte, nones. A Santa Cruz se llegaba por barco o se salían por caminos a Jibacoa para coger máquinas de alquiler. Aquí no había nada. Y que este señor llegara a través de una linda historia de amor y llegara aquí y decidiera que aquí él iba a hacer su central y que aquí él iba a invertir su dinero y que aquí él iba a hacer eso, yo debo pensar que fue un momento de locura. O un hombre extraordinariamente apasionado de sus ideas, que es como bordear la locura.
The Hershey Cuban Railway was built around the town of Central Hershey and its massive sugar refinery. Originally, the town was home to 2,000 Cuban employees and their families, but the population quickly grew. The houses were equipped with unheard-of conveniences, such as hot and cold running water, electricity, and private lawns. Residents were specifically encouraged to garden, as this would foster domestic pride and help them be happy workers. The streets of the town had sidewalks. There was a school. Workers received free medical care for their on-the-job injuries, and the list of perks and benefits went on. At a time when the echoes of slavery still resounded bitterly in the memory of Cuba's poor, Milton Hershey's investment in the civic, social, and financial well-being of his employees and their families was unprecedented, even revolutionary. Throughout the Caribbean, sugarcane had been a cash cow for centuries, but had enriched only a few. Originally, the cane was worked by African slaves brought to the island specifically to man the trapiches, or sugarcane crushers. Larger trapiches were turned by horses or oxen, saving slave labor for the many other steps involved in turning cane into sugar, such as cutting, hauling, boiling, skimming, and packaging. As the world market for cane sugar expanded, the simple man and animal-powered trapiches were replaced by ingenios, or mills, which were powered by water, or in some areas of the Caribbean, by wind. The slave population in Cuba grew. Slave settlements were called batalles, and life in the batalles was harsh. Slaves resided in bunkhouses segregated by sex and worked back-breaking hours with few benefits beyond basic food and lodging. Slavery was abolished in Cuba in 1886. Even so, living conditions at the batalles remained miserable well into the 20th century.
En muchos de estos centrales que ya venían del siglo XIX o del siglo XVIII, ya estos se reestructuraron bastante, pero que todavía venían de esta etapa de la esclavitud. Estos barracones que fueron, lo que se hizo fue adecuarlos para que vivieran familias, sobre todo negras, pero no siempre negras, Ahí vivían de todos los colores, ahí el factor común era el hambre. Y lo que hacían era abrirle, añadirle quizás a mejorarle una puerta si se no tenía, o agrandarle la ventanita. Y yo le puedo asegurar una cosa, es impresionante con todo y el arreglo y la puertecita y la ventana. Si usted quiere sentirlo fuerte, usted entra a uno de esos barracones adaptados, se mete en ese pedacito, cierra la puerta y se queda allá adentro. Si no le agarra la claustrofobia, usted no sabe lo que es nada. Es espantoso meterse dentro de eso. Bueno, en esos cuartitos vivían familias enteras en los batalles, ya después de abolir la esclavitud.
The advent of mechanization and railway both simplified and intensified the work of Cuba's toiling masses. It also raised the ingenios to a whole new level of commercial prominence. Thus originated the humongous operation known as the Central. The earliest centrales were steam-powered, but electrical power followed quickly. Each central was literally the center of a finely tuned sugarcane processing microcosm, and its operation was truly central to every aspect of Cuban life. By the time Milton Hershey arrived in Cuba in 1916, about 200 centrales dotted the Cuban landscape. Most were colossal and had furnished vast fortunes to their proprietors, who were more often American or European than Cuban, and a decent living to a few skilled workers. But even after slavery, the remainder of the Central's workforce lived, with few exceptions, in grinding poverty. Most significantly, the Centrales of the early 20th century provided steady work for just 2 or 3 months out of the year, around the time of the cane harvest. The remaining 9 or 10 months were known as el tiempo muerto, the dead time. During this off-season, the residents of the batalles had no choice but to stay put and scrounge, or to scour the countryside for work, until the next harvest. The town that came to be known as Central Hershey was a batey in name only, since it was so unlike any that had come before it. Where the batalles of yore had offered workers dwellings that were at best cramped, functional, and drab like the ones shown here, Central Hershey provided single-family homes that were lived in and owned year-round, even in the dreaded off-season. Central Hershey's focal point was the 8-story refinery. Like the railway, it was state-of-the-art for its time. In 1920, an industry magazine reported, "Central Hershey's buildings are undoubtedly the finest on the island, both in design and in the materials of which they are made." The next year, the refinery became one of the first in Cuba to be electrically powered. It also made waves as the only refinery in Cuba that processed sugarcane from start to finish by fully automated processes. At the time, only 5% of Cuban refineries turned out a fully refined product.
First of all, he wanted the best. He wanted quality. Quality was always, in anything he did, important. But also, he loved the Cuban people, and he wanted things the best for them too, and they wanted the best for things in his towns.
Our goal at Hershey's is to keep you smiling. As you'll see, it's all about the milk.
Because of how Milton Hershey does things, creating what he needs rather than simply just, purchasing, I think that the challenge of Cuba made it an attractive venture for him.
He was brought up that if God favored you and you did well, then you had a responsibility to take care of your fellow man.
A lot of times when you think about a company town, the company towns are characterized as, providing, the most basic of necessities in terms of housing, and that might be all that's provided. But Milton Hershey recognized that workers' well-being was equally important.
In his office, he had a plaque, and it said, "Business is a matter of human service." You don't see that today in business, but that's what he truly believed.
Fortunately for the workforce, cane harvesting has always called for a good supply of laborers. From the first cut, the juice inside a stalk of sugarcane begins an oxidation process that will eventually degrade its sweetness. So the first step, cutting, relied on speed. For this task, there was no machine faster than the blade of a skilled Cuban machetero. The cut cane was stacked on carts, then hauled overland by as many as 6 oxen to the nearest train line. There it was loaded onto train cars by crane and transported as far as 30 miles to the refinery. Inside the refinery, a series of powerful mechanical crushers channeled the sweet cane juice, called guarapo, into boilers which evaporated the water, accounting for some 80% of its mass. Next, the guarapo was clarified, filtered, and evaporated. The resulting mass was reboiled until the sucrose crystallized. After a spin in the centrifuge to separate any remaining impurities, the sugar was finished. It was bagged and loaded onto a train, then shipped 5 miles to the port of Santa Cruz del Norte. There, the entire train was loaded onto a ship like this one and ferried to the U.S. mainland. Destination, the chocolate factory in Hershey, Pennsylvania. The process was so meticulously engineered that between Central Hershey and Hershey, Pennsylvania, the bags of sugar never left the train. Today, less than 90 of the original 251 miles of railway track are still in use, and even fewer remain electrified. Most of the original train cars on the Hershey Cuban Railway have now been replaced with European hand-me-downs, like this one from Spain. But the ride itself is pure vintage. In its first year of operation, Central Hershey produced 32 million pounds of refined sugar. That's enough to make about 1.5 million Hershey chocolate bars. Initially, all the refined sugar was shipped directly to the Hershey factory in Pennsylvania. But production soon exceeded need, and surplus sugar was sold to other companies, such as the Coca-Cola Company of Atlanta, for which Hershey became the largest sugar provider. Milton Hershey soon expanded his Cuba enterprise by buying 2 more refineries outright, Central Rosario in 1920 and Central San Antonio in 1925. Hershey's business was booming, and life for his employees and their families was comfortable. But tides were shifting, and Hershey's Cuba, like Cuba as a whole, did not escape the march of history. Gerardo Machado y Morales, elected to the office of president by a landslide in 1925. The price of sugar had hit an all-time low, and the Cuban economy was in deep recession. Cubans looked to him for rescue. Julio Antonio Mejia, a college student, founded the Cuban Communist Party the same year. Sensing foreign meddling, President Machado had the Communist Party outlawed. But communism resonated in Cuba, especially among its poor, who saw the principles of Marxism and Leninism as a fresh opportunity to improve their lives. The Cuban Communist Party managed to flourish covertly. In 1929, Julio Mejia was shot dead on the street in Havana, probably by orders from President Machado. In the outcry that followed Mejia's murder, public support for the Communist Party grew. That same year, the U.S. stock market crashed. The market price of sugar plummeted. In an emergency measure to drive the price back up, President Machado placed caps on production. The caps triggered massive layoffs and wage cuts at centrales across the country, and paralyzing strikes began. Hershey employees were pressured to join the strikes, and on more than one occasion, train movements along the Hershey Cuban Railway were interrupted. In response to the nationwide strikes, President Machado banned public protest and imprisoned critics. His name quickly became synonymous with brutality. Milton Hershey accepted President Machado's sugar production caps, but never cut employee wages to absorb the lost revenue. "My workers are not my partners," he said, "so they don't have to share my loss." By not passing the company loss on to his workers, Hershey empowered them to focus on other things, which they did. In 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, the Central Hershey baseball team won its first national title.
He was made honorary citizens of things. He was named the Sportsman of the Year for his support. He had all kinds of awards because he did so much. In Hershey, one of the first things he did in the early 1900s was he started a band and supported music and plays and things. And he did the same thing down there. He tried to support them in some of their cultural activities as well as just the basic necessities of things. And he believed heavily in sports. He thought that was very important.
A mí me gusta hacer una comparación. No sé si en su país a los niños chiquitos de hace un tiempo atrás le daban pastillas para los parásitos. Y aquí, en Cuba, eran grandes así, amarillas y amargas. Las madres se la daban a los niños. Tómatela o te mato. Otras madres se la envolvían en algo que le conocemos aquí como dulce guayaba. Riquísimo, si no lo ha probado, eso es riquísimo. Dulce guayaba, envolvían la pastilla, te la ponían en la boca para que el niño no padeciera. Pues en otros batalles, en otros lugares, era la pastilla amarga. Aquí era envuelta en dulce guayaba. Más o menos. Los salarios eran mejores, las consideraciones eran mejores. Los pagos del alquiler de las viviendas eran más bajos, no había que pagar las reparaciones de las casas. Los chiquillos tenían facilidades para viajar a estudiar en la universidad o en los institutos, en el tren con un descuento. Había los que trabajaban el ingenio, aquí se trabajaba, digamos, zafra y refinación. Inclusive en los años 30 se construye una planta de aceite de maní con el propósito explicitado claramente por la empresa, que era para trabajar en el tiempo muerto, es decir, cuando no había zafra, para que los trabajadores tuvieran donde ubicarse.
Bueno, si me permiten, de Hershey se pudiera estar hablando años, porque formó un pueblo donde hizo una industria, donde le dio comida a millones de hombres, de familia. obreros, mujeres en aquella época, y las mujeres estaban discriminadas. Mi tía fue una de las que trabajó en la planta, en la refinería, cosiendo los sacos, porque además de ser un hombre millonario, se recuperaba todo, ¿entiendes? Entonces eso es una cosa que no se puede olvidar en aquella época. Muchas cosas. Hizo escuelas para niños pobres.
En Aguacate.
En Aguacate, una escuela para niños huérfanos.
While life in Central Hershey remained mostly calm, civil unrest across Cuba grew to fever pitch. At the height of the conflict, President Machado invited Milton Hershey to the presidential palace in Havana and bestowed upon him the nation's highest honor, a medal named for Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, hero of Cuba's slave revolution. As he presented the medal, Machado told Hershey, "You have presented to the world a truly admirable organization on Cuban soil. The order of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes has not been lavished. We concede it only when a bit of our soul and all of our admiration goes with it." Just a few months later, President Machado lost his grip on power and was forced to flee the country. The leaderless island plunged into political chaos that lasted 7 years until the election to office of a charismatic and unruly young army colonel named Fulgencio Batista y Saldívar. Although he was a strong capitalist, Batista was endorsed by the Communist Party. It was an endorsement the Communists would soon regret. Perhaps sensing what was to come, Milton Hershey made plans to sell his entire Cuba venture. In the meantime, he returned to his Cuban bate only once more, and only for a day, before his death in 1945 at age 88. The very next year, the sale was finalized, and all of Hershey's Cuban assets, including 60,000 acres of farmland, 3 functioning refineries, and the railway, were sold to an American sugar conglomerate, Cuban Atlantic Sugar. The price tag? $18 million. In 1958, the assets were sold again, this time to a Venezuelan-born tycoon named Julio Lobo for $25 million. In 1958, Lobo was the wealthiest man in Cuba, worth an estimated $200 million. The Hershey acquisition was to be the feather in his cap, but his purchase was poorly timed. Within 3 years, rebels led by Fidel Castro had seized the government and begun to nationalize key industries. Among these were more than 175 centrales, including the 3 Lobo had just bought.
Hoy han sido nacionalizadas las compañías de petróleo. 3 millones de nuestros hermanos carecían de luz eléctrica. Hoy ha sido nacionalizada la compañía de electricidad. En Cuba había pueblos enteros aislados. Hoy ha sido nacionalizada la compañía de teléfonos. Ya estas no son sugar companies. Ahora la tierra es del que la trabaja. Hoy han sido nacionalizados los ingenios azucareros.
In 1960, Julio Lobo was summoned to a midnight meeting by Fidel Castro's finance minister, Ernesto Che Guevara, who had also been named president of the National Bank. Guevara informed Lobo that his vast holdings were about to be brought under government control. However, since Lobo had been helpful to the revolution, Guevara offered him a small salary and invited him to stay on as manager at one of his 17 centrales. Lobo declined the offer and fled Cuba the next day.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached.
At his White House press conference, President Eisenhower announces that Cuba's assigned share of the United States sugar market has been cut by 95% for the balance of 1960, in reply to what I call Fidel Castro's deliberate policy of hostility.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Cuban Army pilots opened the first phase of organized revolt with bombing raids on 3 military bases.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. We have been determined not to be diverted from our central concerns by mere irritants and fanatics. But now further action is required, and it is underway, and these actions may only be the beginning.
Within a few years, most of the Cuban centrales were renamed after revolutionary heroes and places. Central Hershey was renamed after Camilo Cienfuegos, one of Fidel Castro's closest cohorts. Today, a roadside sign identifies the batey by the new name. But the sign at the train station still reminds locals and visitors of the town's first owner. Despite economic sanctions imposed by the United States in 1960, Cuba's sugar industry enjoyed considerable stability, due largely to a trade deal with the Soviet Union that guaranteed a steady flow of petroleum to the economically isolated island. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Cuba found itself struggling to compete on the global sugar market. It was time for tough decisions. In 2002, the Cuban government announced a plan to overhaul the sugar industry in an attempt to make it profitable. Under the plan, roughly half of the 156 remaining ingenios would be shut down and demolished. Of the 3 centrales formerly owned by the Hershey Corporation, 2, Hershey and Rosario, were selected for demolition. The third, San Antonio, was spared.
El central Boris Luis Santa Coloma, primero en comenzar a moler en Mayabeque.
Today, Central San Antonio has been renamed Boris Luis Santa Coloma, and as of the 2012-2013 harvest season, it's still producing sugar.
Aquí se le brinda al cultivo una esmerada atención no solo en la cosecha, sino desde la preparación de los suelos y la siembra, la cual llevan 2 años cumpliendo su plan. Ejemplo de ello son las 1.500 hectáreas sembradas para la venidera zafra azucarera. Hoy sus campos están totalmente poblados.
¿Quién será Eric?
A ver.
Mira qué bueno estos muebles, pero muy buen diseño, muy del movimiento moderno. Señores, cuando esto existía.
Renan Rodriguez is a doctoral student in architecture from Guines, a sugar town just outside Havana. He's part of a team of professors and students seeking to restore Central Hershey.
Bueno, estamos aquí en la instalación del hotel. Antiguamente era una edificación de muchos valores precisamente por el sitio donde estaba ubicado. Esta es una de las calles principales y como calle principal enfrente estaban las oficinas del central y la ubicación de este hotel era muy interesante, sobre todo porque tenía enfrente al sitio, a la nave principal de esta instalación, que es la industria azucarera. Pero hay que ver que en sus inicios había una presencia de un arbolado muy interesante que le daba el remate, el cierre a la perspectiva de esa calle principal enfrente al central. Ahora mismo lo que se decidió posteriormente fue, la decisión era montar aquí oficinas de una planta de baldosa, una planta de cerámica que está funcionando actualmente enfrente de esta misma instalación. Pero eso está detenido, hasta ahora no se sabe si va a continuar. Hay unos cimientos como estos que están aquí, que ya se han fundido con algunas columnas precisamente para la rehabilitación de esta instalación como oficinas. Pero realmente eso está detenido. Por la ubicación que tiene, creo que tiene muchos valores para poderlo reconvertir o retomarlo a su función original o con alguna función de carácter público que pueda integrar a toda la comunidad, ¿no?
So far, Renan's team has succeeded in halting the demolition of the Hershey Ingenio while the authorities review their proposals, which include a rezoning of the town to make it more amenable to tourism, restoration of key sites, and preservation of the town's most iconic features.
Usted sabe que son dos sistemas distintos completamente, pero uno es tan bueno como el otro. El que se pare en una esquina y hable mal de Hershey, de Milton S. Hershey, está hablando sandeces, boberías, porque les vuelvo y les repito, no hay comparación, cada cosa con su cosa. Nosotros nos sentimos privilegiados de haber nacido aquí, en esa época, porque todo era muy lindo al estilo de ustedes y ahora este es muy lindo al estilo de nosotros.
To his thousands of workers, Milton Hershey gave more than just a paycheck. He provided a place to work, play, and raise a family. A place to be happy and call home. Most of all, he offered hope for a better life. Cuba had its full share of sugar barons and millionaires, but it had only one Milton Hershey.